By the beginning of 1917, the Western Front had become a bloody wound, crisscrossing Europe. 3 years of continuous battles had led only to a positional stalemate. The Verdun meat grinder and the Battle of the Somme in 16 had claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but the front line had barely moved. Exhausted armies dug into the earth, transforming the fields of France into a labyrinth of trenches, barbed wire, and machine gun nests. The war, promised to be swift, had turned into an endless confrontation, where every meter of land was paid for with thousands of lives. The Entente command recognized the need for a decisive breakthrough. At a meeting in Chantilly in November 16, a plan for coordinated strikes on all fronts was developed. A key role was assigned to the French offensive under the command of General Nivelle on the Aisne River, while the British were to deliver an auxiliary blow in the Arras area. This strike was intended to divert German reserves and facilitate the task for the French. No one then assumed that it was near Arras that events would unfold that would go down in history as a symbol of heroism and tragedy of the Great War. In the shadow of the coming offensive, the British command launched unprecedented preparations. The operation near Arras was planned as a diversionary maneuver to support the French offensive on the Aisne River, but the thoroughness of its development spoke of serious ambitions. General Allenby, commander of the Third Army, had 17 infantry divisions and 5 cavalry divisions at his disposal. A special role was assigned to the Canadian Corps under the command of General Julian Byng. It was he who was to storm the impregnable Vimy Ridge. 4 Canadian divisions were to act as a single force for the first time in history, which in itself became an important moment for the national self-awareness of Canadians. Preparations for the offensive began in the autumn months of 1916. A grandiose engineering operation unfolded near Arras. Hundreds of sappers and miners laid underground tunnels. By April 1917, a real underground city with barracks, hospitals, and ammunition depots had been created underground. The tunnels, stretching for 20 kilometers, allowed troops to be secretly moved to the front line and were supposed to ensure the element of surprise. Canadians particularly carefully studied the terrain. On the rear positions, accurate models of Vimy Ridge were created, where units practiced every step of the future offensive. Soldiers knew by heart every bend in the terrain, every potential enemy firing point. A new tactic of infantry assault, called the creeping barrage, was practiced to automatism. Infantrymen were to move in close proximity to the wall of explosions of their artillery, which methodically moved fire forward by 100 meters every 3 minutes. This required ideal coordination and iron discipline. Artillery preparation was also planned on an unprecedented scale. By the beginning of April, 2,800 guns had been pulled into position, 1 gun for every 9 meters of the front. A week before the offensive, methodical shelling of German positions began. Allied aviation gained temporary air superiority, which allowed for accurate reconnaissance and adjustment of artillery fire. Special attention was paid to new tactical techniques. Infantry received light mortars and grenades, allowing them to independently suppress pockets of resistance. Special assault groups were formed, trained in rapid breakthroughs and bypassing fortified points. Unlike previous offensives, when soldiers marched in dense ranks towards machine guns, it was now intended to use scattered chains and flexible tactics. The command set ambitious but specific goals for the troops. The first day was to bring a breakthrough of the enemy's front line of defense. The second and third, the capture of the second line and key heights. By the end of the 4th day, it was planned to reach operational space and create conditions for a large-scale breakthrough. While the British and Canadians prepared for a decisive blow, the German command was not idle. By the spring of 1917, the German army had created one of the most powerful defensive systems in the history of military art near Arras, the famous Siegfried Line, which the Germans themselves called the Hindenburg position. This line became the embodiment of a new military doctrine developed by General Erich Ludendorff. Its essence lay in abandoning rigid defense of forward positions in favor of a deeply echeloned system, allowing flexible response to enemy breakthroughs. The defense consisted of 3 main belts, up to 8 kilometers deep. Each belt included 2 or 3 lines of trenches, connected by communication trenches. The front line, which bore the brunt of enemy artillery fire, was relatively lightly manned. Only combat outposts and observers were located there. The main forces were concentrated in the second and third lines, which allowed for the preservation of manpower during artillery preparation. The German dugouts and shelters became true masterpieces of military engineering. Carved into the chalk cliffs up to 30 meters deep, they reliably protected garrisons from the heaviest shells. Many shelters had concrete ceilings up to 3 meters thick, electric lighting, and ventilation. They could accommodate entire companies with provisions and ammunition for several days. Machine gun nests played a special role in the defense. The Germans masterfully used the tenants, positioning machine guns to create crossfire zones. Many firing points were camouflaged and pushed forward, allowing for flanking fire on advancing chains. MG-08 machine guns, capable of firing up to 650 rounds per minute, turned any attack into a suicidal undertaking. Extensive fields of wire entanglements, up to 40 meters wide, stretched in front of the trenches. Barbed wire was stretched in several rows on metal stakes driven into the ground at various angles. Overcoming such obstacles required prolonged artillery preparation. Artillery support for the defense was organized with German pedantry. Every sector of the front was zeroed in, and the coordinates of the most important lines were entered into special tables. This allowed for accurate fire, even in conditions of poor visibility. Batteries were located on the reverse slopes of heights, which made their detection and destruction difficult. But the main innovation of the German defensive doctrine was the principle of active and flexible defense. Instead of holding forward positions at all costs, the German command planned a controlled retreat to pre-prepared lines with subsequent counterattacks. Specially trained storm troops were to strike the flanks of a breakthrough enemy. Ludendorff understood that the Allies would sooner or later break through the first line of defense, and prepared not to prevent the breakthrough, but to localize and eliminate it. This strategy required high troop training and the initiative of junior commanders, but the German army at that time fully possessed these qualities. April 9th, 1917, 5:30 in the morning. The pre-dawn silence over the fields of Arras was suddenly shattered by a deafening roar. 2,800 British guns simultaneously opened fire on German positions. The earth trembled, the air filled with the whistle of shells and the thunder of explosions. An artillery barrage had begun, destined to go down in history as one of the most powerful of the entire First World War. The sky above the front line was illuminated by flashes of gunfire, and German trenches disappeared in clouds of smoke and dust. Unlike previous offensives, when artillery preparation lasted for days and deprived the attack of the element of surprise, this time the British employed new tactics. The hurricane fire lasted only 40 minutes, but its intensity compensated for its brevity. Over 1 million shells were fired at German positions. A true steel hurricane crashed down on the enemy's defensive structures. At 5:30 in the morning, the first waves of British and Canadian infantry rose from the trenches. Ahead of them moved a wall of explosions. The famous every 3 minutes artillery fire shifted 100 meters forward, and the infantry followed literally on the heels of this fiery curtain. German soldiers, stunned by the artillery preparation, did not have time to take up positions at their machine guns when the attackers crashed into them. The weather seemed to have decided to test the attackers. A cold wind brought icy rain with snow, turning the battlefield into a muddy mess. But this same weather also brought an unexpected advantage. The wind blew at the attackers' backs and into the defenders' faces. The snow blinded German machine gunners, preventing them from firing accurately. The offensive developed with unprecedented speed. Just an hour after the start of the attack, the advanced British units had overcome the first line of defense and were moving towards the second. Particularly impressive was the success of the Canadian Corps on Vimy Ridge. This elevation, dominating the surrounding area, was considered impregnable. The Germans had held it since 1914, turning it into a real fortress. The French had tried twice to take the ridge and twice retreated, losing tens of thousands of soldiers. Now the Canadians were tackling this task. 4 Canadian divisions attacked simultaneously along the entire front of the ridge. For the first time in Canadian history, its troops acted as a single force. Months of training and meticulous preparation paid off. Despite fierce German resistance, the Canadians methodically advanced. By noon, most of the ridge was in their hands. The German command was caught off guard by the speed and scale of the offensive. Reserves did not have time to pull up to the breakthrough points. By the end of the first day of the battle, British and Canadian troops had advanced up to 6 kilometers deep, an unprecedented result for trench warfare. More than 9,000 prisoners and a large amount of artillery were captured. Especially valuable trophies were German maps, with the exact location of defensive positions and artillery batteries. Vimy Ridge rose above the fields of Arras like a stern guardian, repelling all Allied attempts to capture it for almost 3 years. This strategic height, controlling vast territories, became a symbol of the impregnability of German defenses. The French twice tried to storm it and twice retreated, leaving thousands dead on its slopes. Now this task fell to the Canadians, and they were ready to prove their combat prowess. At dawn on April 9th, 4 Canadian divisions lined up along the base of the ridge. For the first time in history, the troops of the young Dominion acted as a single force. In the ranks stood loggers from British Columbia, farmers from the prairies of Saskatchewan, fishermen from the maritime provinces, and city dwellers from Toronto and Montreal. Different in origin, they felt themselves part of a single whole, the Canadian nation, born in the crucible of war. Under the command of General Arthur Currie, the first Canadian to lead a Canadian division, the soldiers began their ascent following the artillery barrage. They moved through snow and icy wind, scrambling up muddy slopes. Before them was not just a military task. They were storming a height that many considered impregnable. A distinctive feature of the Canadian offensive was meticulous preparation. Every soldier knew his task. Instead of traditional dense infantry lines, the Canadians used small assault groups armed with hand grenades and light machine guns. They bypassed pockets of resistance, infiltrated between German fortifications, and attacked from the flanks and rear. The feats of individual soldiers and officers on that day entered Canadian history. Lieutenant Mike O'Rourke, a former miner from Nova Scotia, destroyed 3 machine gun nests, allowing his company to overcome a particularly difficult section. Even after being wounded in the shoulder, he continued to lead his men forward until he lost consciousness from blood loss. Corporal Francis Pegamagabo, an Ojibwe sniper, single-handedly captured a group of 10 German soldiers by infiltrating the rear of an enemy position. His incredible skill and fearlessness inspired his comrades and struck terror into his enemies. By noon, the Canadians had captured most of the ridge, and by evening, the entire strategic height was in their hands. The Germans, who had defended this position for almost 3 years, could not believe that it had fallen in a single day. The Canadian Corps captured over 4,000 prisoners and dozens of guns. The price of victory was high. More than 3,500 Canadian soldiers died in the assault, and another 7,000 were wounded. The victory at Vimy Ridge became a turning point in Canadian history. For the first time, Canadians acted as a unified national force, succeeding where others had failed. This victory fostered a sense of national pride and self-awareness that had previously been absent in the young Dominion. Prime Minister Robert Borden would later say, "On the slopes of Vimy, the Canadian nation was born." The French government, recognizing the historical significance of this victory, ceded land on Vimy Ridge to Canada for the creation of a memorial. Today, a magnificent monument of white limestone rises above the battlefield, commemorating the 11,285 Canadians who died in France during the First World War and have no known grave. April 10, 1917. After the resounding success of the first day of the offensive, the British command was gripped by euphoria. It seemed that the breakthrough, which the Entente strategists had so long dreamed of, had finally come to pass. However, war rarely grants easy victories, and the Arras offensive was no exception. The weather, a faithful ally of the attackers on the first day, now turned against them. The icy rain intensified, turning the battlefield into a sticky quagmire. Artillery pieces bogged down in the mud, shells fell short of their targets, and infantry struggled to cover every meter of the washed-out ground. The German command, having recovered from the initial shock, hastily transferred reserves to the breakthrough points. Fresh units occupied pre-prepared positions on the third line of defense. The famous flexibility of the German defensive doctrine began to manifest itself. On April 11th, British and Canadian troops continued the offensive, but the pace of advance noticeably slowed. If on the first day they had covered up to 6 kilometers, they now struggled to cover a few hundred meters. German machine gunners, having recovered from the artillery shock, delivered aimed fire at the attacking waves. A particularly difficult situation developed on the right flank of the offensive, where the British Fifth Army encountered fierce resistance near the village of Bullecourt. Here, the Germans carried out a successful counterattack, pushing the British back to their initial positions. By the evening of April 11th, it became clear that the element of surprise had been lost. The German defense, secretly by the initial blow, was regaining its strength. The commander of the Third Army, General Allenby, demanded maximum effort from his subordinates to exploit the success. But objective conditions worked against the attackers. April 12th became a day of disappointments. The offensive practically stalled along the entire front. Artillery could not provide sufficient support due to washed-out roads and difficulties with ammunition supply. Aviation, so effective on the first day, now struggled to get airborne due to low clouds and strong winds. The Germans, meanwhile, brought up artillery reserves and began methodically shelling British positions. Units attempting to consolidate their hold on captured lines suffered particularly heavy losses. The offensive was turning into a bloody positional struggle. By mid-April, the Allied offensive had finally bogged down in the quagmire of the Arras fields. The second week of the battle witnessed how even the most brilliant tactical success could turn into a bloody drama. Torrential rains transformed the land into a viscous mess, where heavy artillery sank up to its axles, and soldiers struggled to pull their feet out of the sticky mud. Advancing columns stretched out, lost momentum, and became easy targets for German machine gunners who had recovered from the initial shock. On April 13th, British infantry made a desperate attempt to break through the second line of German defense near the village of Monchy-le-Preux. A company of the Yorkshire Regiment, under the command of Captain James Fenton, attacked 3 times and was repulsed 3 times, leaving dozens of dead and wounded in no man's land. Out of 120 men, only 37 remained in formation by evening. A German MG-08 machine gun, positioned on the flank, methodically mowed down the attacking lines. Only when Sergeant Thomas Hardy with 2 volunteers managed to outflank the strongpoint from the rear and throw grenades at it was the company able to secure a foothold on the outskirts of the village. But even this local success was negated by a powerful German counterattack the following morning. The Canadians, who had heroically taken Vimy Ridge, now struggled to repel fierce counterattacks by German stormtroopers. Particularly intense fighting unfolded for Hill 145, where the 3rd Canadian Division held positions for 3 days, repelling up to 6 attacks a day. Without ammunition resupply, without hot food, under continuous artillery fire, the Canadians stood to the death. When ammunition ran out, they fought with bayonets and entrenching tools. Of the 800 men who occupied positions on the hill, fewer than 200 remained by the time reinforcements arrived. On April 15th, the weather seemed determined to finish off the exhausted soldiers. A biting wind and sleet were added to the rain. The temperature dropped below freezing, and water in the shell craters covered with a thin crust of ice. The wounded, lying in no man's land, froze to death before medics could reach them. British generals, observing the battlefield from relatively comfortable headquarters, demanded new attacks. General Haig, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces, insisted on continuing the offensive at all costs. He was interested not so much in tactical success at Arras as in diverting German reserves from the French sector of the front, where General Nivelle's offensive was being prepared. Soldiers paid for this strategy with their lives. On April 16th, a tragedy occurred that became a symbol of the senseless losses of the second week of the battle. The British 11th Division received orders to attack a heavily fortified German position near the village of Wancourt. Intelligence reported numerous machine gun nests and minefields in front of the German trenches. Artillery preparation was insufficient due to a shortage of shells and difficulties in their delivery. The division commander, General Fowler, tried to get the attack cancelled, or at least postponed until tanks arrived. But Army headquarters was adamant. Behind the brilliant beginning of the Battle of Arras lay the ambitions of the British command, which soon turned into a tragedy for thousands of soldiers. Commander-in-Chief of the British forces, General Douglas Haig, and Commander of the Third Army, General Edmund Allenby, found themselves trapped by their own illusions, unable to soberly assess the situation after the initial success. Blinded by euphoria from breaking through the first line of defense, they continued to push exhausted soldiers forward when all objective factors demanded a halt or a revision of tactics. Haig's fatal mistake was his stubborn adherence to the original plan, without taking into account changing circumstances. When the Germans recovered from the initial shock and began to transfer reserves, and the weather turned the battlefield into an impassable swamp, the British command continued to demand frontal attacks on fortified positions. General Allenby, nicknamed "Quote" for his assertive character, refused to admit that the moment for a decisive breakthrough had been missed. His orders became increasingly detached from reality. On April 17th, he demanded that the exhausted 29th Division attack Hill 130, although intelligence reported 20 machine gun nests on its approaches. The result was the death of more than 800 soldiers in 3 hours of fruitless assault. Comparing the actions of the British command at Arras with other battles of the First World War, one cannot help but notice a recurring pattern. The same blind faith in, quote, led to disaster on the Somme in 1916, when the British lost 60,000 men on the first day of the offensive. The same inflexibility of thinking doomed the Third Battle of Ypres, known as Passchendaele, to failure. The fate of the cavalry units at Arras is particularly indicative. Haig, a former cavalry officer, believed until the very end in the possibility of a cavalry breakthrough and kept 5 cavalry divisions ready. Thousands of horsemen waited for an order that never came. Machine guns and barbed wire made cavalry attacks suicidal. These forces, used as dismounted riflemen, could have been much more useful in decisive sectors. A tragic example of strategic short-sightedness was the disregard for intelligence data. By April 14th, British intelligence knew about the transfer of 6 fresh German divisions to the Arras area, but Haig refused to adjust his plans. He was obsessed with the idea of supporting the French offensive on the Aisne River and was willing to sacrifice his soldiers for this goal. The irony of fate was that General Nivelle's offensive, which the Arras operation was supposed to support, itself turned into a disaster and led to mutinies in the French army. In the spring of 1917, the Battle of Arras unfolded not in a vacuum, but as part of a larger Allied strategy on the Western Front. To understand its true significance, one must consider the French context of this battle. The Arras offensive was conceived as a diversionary strike, intended to draw German reserves away from the sector where the main offensive was being prepared. General Robert Nivelle's operation on the Aisne River. Nivelle, the new commander-in-chief of the French army, had promised politicians and the public a decisive breakthrough that would end the stalemate of trench warfare. His plan envisioned a massive assault on the Reims-Soissons sector, utilizing new tactics and an unprecedented concentration of artillery. The British offensive at Arras was scheduled to begin a week before the French, to force the German command to transfer reserves north, weakening their defenses in front of the French front. French generals eagerly awaited the results of the Battle of Arras. The initial reports of British and Canadian successes on April 9th sparked euphoria in Paris. It seemed the strategy was working. The Germans had indeed begun to hastily redeploy reinforcements to Arras, weakening other sectors of the front. Nivelle was confident that his offensive, scheduled for April 16th, would complete the enemy's defeat. However, reality proved far harsher. When French troops attacked, they met fierce resistance. The German command, having learned from Arras, had reinforced their artillery positions and machine gun nests. The French offensive stalled on the very first day, and subsequent attacks only increased the casualty count. By April 20th, it became clear that Nivelle's plan had failed. The French army, exhausted by 3 years of war and enormous losses at Verdun, was at the limit of its morale. The disappointment of the failed offensive, on which such hopes had been placed, was the final straw. In late April, unrest began in some French units, which escalated into open mutinies by May. Soldiers refused to attack, demanding better service conditions and a more meaningful strategy. They were willing to defend their homeland, but not to sacrifice their lives in senseless frontal assaults. The mutinies engulfed almost half of the French divisions on the Western Front. This was an unprecedented crisis that could have led to a complete collapse of the front. The Germans, fortunately for the Allies, were unaware of the scale of the problem. In these circumstances, the continuation of the British offensive at Arras took on new significance. Even when it became clear that a breakthrough was impossible, Haig continued the attacks to tie down German reserves and prevent them from falling upon the demoralized French army. British and Canadian soldiers, unaware of the situation with their allies, paid with their lives for the stability of the entire Western Front. For the German High Command, the April events at Arras became a serious test of resilience. The first hours of the Allied offensive plunged headquarters into shock. The speed of the British breakthrough surpassed the most pessimistic forecasts. Colonel Max Hoffmann, head of the operational department of the Eastern Front, who was on inspection in the West, wrote in his diary, "April 9th showed the limits of even the most perfect defense. No engineering structures can withstand such a concentration of artillery fire." General Ludendorff, the de facto head of the German army, upon receiving news of the front breakthrough, remained calm. "We have defensive depth," he said at an emergency meeting. "Let the British exhaust themselves on the second and third lines." This confidence was based on a new defensive doctrine that the Germans implemented after the bloody battles of the 16th year. However, the loss of Vimy Ridge, considered impregnable, was a psychological blow for the Germans. Lieutenant Ernst Junger, commander of an assault company and future famous writer, recalled, "When we learned that the Canadians took Vimy in one day, many could not believe it. This ridge had been a symbol of our steadfastness for almost 3 years." The German command acted decisively. By the evening of April 9th, reserves from other sectors of the front were hastily transferred to the breakthrough area. 5 fresh divisions were withdrawn from the French direction and thrown to Arras. This was exactly what the Allied command had counted on, planning the operation as a diversionary maneuver before the French offensive on the Aisne River. German machine gun teams played a special role in stabilizing the front. The MG-08 crews showed incredible steadfastness, often fighting to the last bullet. Non-commissioned officer Heinrich Müller, with his machine gun, held the approaches to the village of Fampoux for 2 days, repelling 7 attacks by British infantry. When his position was finally outflanked, he managed to destroy the machine gun and retreat with the remnants of his crew. By April 12th, the German defense had regained its stability. General Otto von Below, commander of the First Army facing the British, skillfully maneuvered reserves, plugging gaps in the defense. He used the tactic of elastic defense, allowing forward units to withdraw under enemy pressure, but immediately counterattacking as soon as the offensive ran out of steam. For ordinary German soldiers, the Battle of Arras became a test of their spirit. Sergeant Wilhelm Koch of the 157th Infantry Regiment wrote home, "Their artillery plows the earth. It seems that hell itself has opened above us. But when the fiery squall passes, we climb out of our shelters and take up positions again. As long as we are alive, no Englishman will pass." German officers noted the increased skill of the British. Captain Erich Remarque, future author of All Quiet on the Western Front, wrote in a report, "These are no longer the inexperienced volunteers of the 16th year. Before us are professional soldiers, skillfully using the terrain and fire support." The new tactical methods of the Allies caused particular concern for the German command. The creeping barrage method and the use of assault groups with grenades and light machine guns required a revision of defensive concepts. Ludendorff ordered the acceleration of the formation of his own assault battalions, armed with flamethrowers and mortars. The Battle of Arras, which began as a brilliant tactical success, turned into heavy losses for the Allied forces. The price paid for limited territorial gains proved exorbitant. By the end of April 1917, British and Canadian forces had lost about 160,000 men, killed, wounded, and missing. Losses were particularly heavy among junior officers and non-commissioned officers, the most experienced and valuable personnel. Some regiments lost up to 70% of their strength. A Scottish division, participating in the assault on the village of Rouen, lost 3/4 of its personnel in 3 days of fighting. German losses were significantly smaller, about 75,000 men. The effectiveness of deeply echeloned defense was confirmed. Even after losing the first line of fortifications, the Germans were able to preserve the main part of their forces. The territorial gains of the Allies looked modest against the backdrop of the sacrifices made. In 3 weeks of bloody fighting, the British and Canadians advanced an average of 8 kilometers, capturing a strip of land about 20 kilometers long. The strategic gain from this advance was minimal. The front line only slightly changed its contours. At the same time, every meter of recaptured land cost approximately 20 human lives. The ratio of expended resources to achieved results looked depressing. More than 2.5 million artillery shells alone were expended. By some estimates, their cost exceeded the annual budget of the pre-war British fleet. The long-term consequences of such losses for the British and Canadian armies proved serious. Many elite units, such as the Scottish Highlanders and Canadian Rifles, required months to restore their combat effectiveness. The loss of experienced non-commissioned officers and junior officers could not be quickly replenished. Training new personnel took time. As a result, the combat effectiveness of British troops temporarily decreased, which affected subsequent operations in 1917. For Canada, the losses at Arras, especially at Vimy Ridge, became a national tragedy. Of the 50,000 Canadians who participated in the battle, more than 10,000 were killed or wounded. Practically no family in the Dominion was left that did not mourn a deceased relative. However, these sacrifices paradoxically contributed to the strengthening of national self-awareness. Canadians were proud that their soldiers coped with a task that proved beyond the capabilities of British and French troops. Today, the Battle of Arras holds a special place in the historical memory of the peoples whose sons fought on those bloody fields in the spring of 1917. For each participating country, this battle acquired its own symbolic meaning, becoming part of national identity and collective memory. In Great Britain, the memory of Arras is inextricably linked with the image of sacrifice and resilience. Numerous memorials, scattered across the country, immortalize the names of the fallen. Particularly touching are the small monuments in provincial towns, where the names of local residents who never returned from the fields of France are listed. In post-war British literature, Arras became a symbol of the futility of war and the tragedy of the lost generation. Poets Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, who went through the crucible of this battle, created poignant works that shattered the romantic image of war in public consciousness. For Canada, Vimy Ridge became a sacred place of national pride. The majestic memorial of white limestone, erected on the crest of the ridge, became the main monument to all Canadians who died in the First World War. Every year, on April 9th, thousands of Canadians gather here to honor the memory of their ancestors. In school history textbooks, the Battle of Vimy is described as the birth moment of the Canadian nation. Interestingly, the French government officially transferred the land around the memorial to Canada in perpetual ownership. This small plot is considered Canadian territory in the heart of France. In France, the attitude towards the Arras offensive is more contradictory. On the one hand, the French recognize the heroism of British and Canadian soldiers. On the other hand, this battle recalls the failure of the Nivelle offensive and the subsequent mutinies, which almost led to the collapse of the entire front. In official historiography, Arras often remains in the shadow of battles more significant for French national consciousness, Verdun and the Marne. In Germany, the memory of the Battle of Arras was long viewed through the prism of the stab in the back. The myth that the German army was not defeated on the battlefield, but fell victim to betrayal from the home front. Military theorists of the Weimar Republic carefully studied the experience of Arras, especially the effectiveness of deeply echeloned defense. These lessons were used in creating the defensive doctrine of the Wehrmacht in the Second World War. In art, the Battle of Arras has been reflected in numerous works. Particularly noteworthy are the paintings by Canadian artist Alfred Munnings, who captured the attack on Vimy Ridge, and Eric Maria Remarque's novel All Quiet on the Western Front, which describes events through the eyes of a German soldier. In recent years, cinema has seen a resurgence of interest in this battle. In 2008, the Canadian film Dawn over Vimy was released, receiving critical acclaim for its accurate depiction of events. The lessons of the Battle of Arras for military science proved to be multifaceted. This battle demonstrated both the effectiveness of new tactical techniques, the creeping barrage, the use of storm troops and careful operation preparation, and the limitations of purely frontal attacks against deeply echeloned defenses. Military theorists drew an important conclusion from Arras. Even the most successful tactical breakthrough does not guarantee strategic victory without mechanized forces to exploit the success.